Welcome to the deep dive. Ever feel like, your brain could use a bit of an upgrade? In our pretty relentless modern lives, that quest for a mental edge, it feels almost universal. Whether you're maybe a student facing exams, a professional navigating a really demanding workload, or honestly, simply someone who wants to feel sharper, more focused, and consistently on, you've probably encountered the buzz around smart drugs or brain boosters.
Right.
They promise this kind of shortcut to enhanced cognitive abilities, a way to unlock your brain's full, maybe untapped potential.
It's an incredibly appealing concept, isn't it? This idea that a single compound could sharpen your memory, boost your focus, give you that edge. Today, our deep dive is really designed to navigate a specific and often, frankly, misunderstood class of compounds, the Afinil. We're talking about substances like Modafinil, Armodafinil, Adrafinil, fladrafinil, and esmodafinil. We'll be sort of sifting through the pretty robust scientific research to uncover what these compounds truly do to the brain, and, just as importantly, what they don't do.
That's right. And our mission for you, our listeners, is really to help you cut through all that hype and understand the hard science. The central question we're tackling today is, well, it's critical. Are these compounds genuine cognitive enhancers? Do they make you inherently smarter, boosting intelligence in some profound way? Or do they primarily just promote wakefulness, essentially masking fatigue and boredom, maybe, without delivering any real lasting intellectual gain? We'll also look at how these effects might differ, quite significantly perhaps, across various user groups. Think, severely sleep-deprived versus healthy folks just looking for an edge, or even specific clinical populations with really unique needs.
Exactly. And to do that, we've grounded this deep dive in a solid body of scientific literature. Our insights are drawn from rigorous clinical trials, lots of academic research, and authoritative health foundations. This isn't about anecdotes or, pop culture stories. It's about giving you an evidence-based understanding that's hopefully both comprehensive and objective. We want to provide the clearest picture possible of what the science truly tells us.
Okay, perfect. So let's start with the basics then. We hear this term nootropics thrown around quite a bit, often used interchangeably with cognitive enhancers. But what exactly are these substances, at their core?
Right. At their most fundamental level, nootropics are essentially a category of drugs that some people use with the intention of improving various aspects of mental function. This includes things like aiming to enhance memory, boost mental alertness and concentration, and increase overall energy levels and wakefulness. Now, it's really vital here to draw a clear distinction. On one hand, you have pharmaceutical drugs. These are specifically designed, tested, approved to treat actual medical conditions like excessive daytime sleepiness from narcolepsy or attention disorders. But then on the other hand, you have this widespread, often unregulated use of these same compounds or very similar ones by healthy individuals, people just trying to gain an edge in cognitive performance for school, for work, whatever it might be.
Okay, so one side is medical need, the other is performance optimization, I guess you could call it. But what does the hard science, particularly from a public health angle, say about that second use case, that quest for an edge in healthy people?
Yeah, this is where we really need to pause and introduce a significant cautionary note. And this comes directly from the Alcohol and Drug Foundation, the ADF, which is a highly respected authority. Their research offers several critical insights that, honestly, often run counter to the popular narrative you hear. First, the ADF concludes that claims suggesting nootropics genuinely improve a healthy person's cognitive processes and performance. Those claims are actually weak.
Weak! Wow, that's a pretty strong statement, especially given how much you hear about, limitless brain power or unlocking potential.
It really is. The solid evidence just isn't there to back up those kinds of sweeping claims for healthy folks. Plus, the ADF highlights that these substances do pose real health risks. They carry the potential for dependence, meaning your body can actually become reliant on them. And their effects, they're only temporary. They only last as long as the drug is active in your system. And maybe most importantly, the ADF is quite emphatic. These drugs do not make people more intelligent. Instead, their primary effect might just be to help mask underlying issues, fatigue, procrastination, maybe even just boredom.
So let me get this straight. The science suggests these smart drugs might just be a kind of expensive way to skip a nap, not actually boost your IQ.
That's a pretty good way to put it, yeah. They give it less like unlocking some inner genius and more like strategically hitting the snooze button on your brain's internal nap time alarm. Though, as we'll definitely get into, that snooze button comes with some serious fine print, some real risks. And there's an even more pressing concern, especially when we talk about younger people. The ADF points out these drugs can be particularly harmful to young people whose brains are still developing a process that continues well into their mid-20s. This long-term risk to neurodevelopment, potential impacts on brain structure, function, it's a significant factor that really demands serious thought. And you'll hear these things called by all sorts of names too, right? Smart drugs, brain boosters, memory enhancers, neuroenhancers, drive drugs, study drugs. It's a whole list.
Okay, that's a really important foundation. So with that understanding, let's zoom in on the specific area we're focusing on today, the Afinil family. You mentioned these fall under a class called eugeroics. Can you maybe break down what that term means?
Certainly. Eugeroics are a distinct class of drugs. Their primary characteristic is promoting wakefulness and alertness. But, crucially, they tend to do this without the kind of generalized stimulant effects you might get from, say, traditional amphetamines or even large doses of caffeine. They're often described more specifically as wakefulness-promoting agents. And within this class, modafinil is widely seen as the flagship. It's pretty much positioned as the most commonly used eugeroic drug that's been extensively studied for its potential cognitive effects.
And it's known by some fairly recognizable brand names, right? Like Modafinil, Modafinil, and Provigil. I've definitely heard Provigil mentioned, both for legit uses and, well, other uses.
You're absolutely right. Provigil especially has become almost a household name, even outside medical circles. But it's so crucial to remember its primary FDA-approved medical uses. Modafinil is a prescription drug mainly for treating severe sleep disorders. This includes narcolepsy, that condition with overwhelming daytime sleepiness and sudden sleep attacks. Also obstructive sleep apnea, where breathing stops and starts during sleep, leading to daytime fatigue. And shift work sleep disorder, affecting people whose work schedules mess up their natural sleep-wake cycle. Its effectiveness in these specific conditions is well established through proper clinical trials.
Okay, so clearly a powerful tool for serious sleep issues. But what about beyond the clinic? I've heard whispers, maybe more than whispers, of modafinil being used in some really unexpected high-stakes places. Is there truth to that?
Oh, there's definitely truth there. One really fascinating example that speaks volumes about its recognized utility is its availability to astronauts. On the International Space Station, it's actually part of their medical kit, specifically for managing fatigue from severe circadian dysynchrony. Basically, when living in orbit throws their internal body clocks completely out of whack, modafinil helps them stay alert and maintain performance. This really highlights its effectiveness in extreme environments where staying vigilant and functional is absolutely critical. It goes way beyond just treating sleep disorders back on Earth.
Wow, from space to maybe a Wall Street trading floor, it seems. Because beyond these critical medical uses in extreme jobs, modafinil has gained this widespread non-medical popularity as a smart drug. We see it talked about amongst students cramming, office workers facing crazy deadlines, even in communities like transhumanists and other professionals looking for, enhanced attention, better cognitive capabilities, alertness.
That's very true. It's seen significant uptake in those non-medical areas, really driven by that desire for a perceived competitive edge. However, its legal status definitely reflects its potential for misuse and its psychoactive nature. In the U.S., for instance, it's a Schedule IV controlled substance. Now, that acknowledges its valid medical uses and suggests a relatively lower potential for abuse compared to, say, classical stimulants like amphetamines. But it's still important to realize it does produce psychoactive effects typical of stimulants, even if its mechanism is a bit different, atypical.
And it hasn't been without controversy, especially in competitive sports, right?
Not at all. The World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, they recognized its performance-enhancing potential quite early on, added it to their prohibited list way back in 2004. And we've seen several high-profile cases, like the American sprinter Kelly White, who was stripped of medals in 2003 after testing positive for modafinil. She claimed it was for narcolepsy, but the ruling stood because of the strict anti-doping rules. These cases really highlight that significant ethical debate. Does an edge gain pharmacologically really align with fair play, or does it undermine athletic integrity? It's a complex question that keeps coming up.
Okay, so modafinil is clearly the big name in the Afinil family. But let's talk about its close relative, Armodafinil. How does it fit in? Is it fundamentally different?
Armodafinil is interesting. It's actually what's called the R enantiomer of modafinil. You can think of it like modafinil's mirror image, a specific chemical form. And this specific structure gives it a slightly longer half-life, which means it can sustain its effects in the body for a bit longer than modafinil. Like modafinil, it's mainly indicated for that excessive sleepiness linked to narcolepsy, obstructive sleep apnea, and shift work sleep disorder. To give you a concrete example of how its effects are studied, let's look at a clinical trial from UF Health. It's listed as NCT02468856.
Okay, tell us about that study. What was its main goal, and why focus specifically on driving simulator performance? That seems quite specific.
Right. The objective of that trial was to precisely characterize armodafinil's effect on driving simulator performance, but specifically in healthy subjects who had undergone significant sleep deprivation. So this wasn't about making them smarter academically or anything like that. It was about understanding if the drug could mitigate the very real, very dangerous cognitive and motor impairments caused by lack of sleep, particularly in a critical task like driving. The researchers were essentially trying to see if armodafinil could restore safe functioning when someone was really fatigued.
And how did they set that up? How did they get such precise data?
They used a really rigorous design, a double-blind crossover trial, which means neither the participants nor the researchers knew who was getting the drug versus a placebo at any given time. It involved 10 healthy subjects who went through 24 hours of total sleep deprivation, a huge stressor. After that, they got either 250 milligrams of armodafinil or a placebo. Then they faced this demanding battery of neurocognitive tests, things like motor praxis assessing motor control, visual object learning testing memory, and the psychomotor vigilance test, which measures sustained attention and reaction time. Crucially, they also had continuous EEG recordings while they were in the driving simulator to monitor brain activity. The relevance here is huge. It aimed to give a clear, objective data on how armodafinil could counter the really deteriorating effects of sleep loss on critical functions like driving and related cognitive abilities. Basically, could it bring people back to a safer baseline?
Fascinating. So really focused on restoring function under stress, not necessarily enhancing it from a normal starting point. What about Adrafinil? I know that's also part of this family.
Yes. Adrafinil is an analog of modafinil, meaning similar chemical structure. What's important about Adrafinil is that it's what we call a prodrug. This means it's not actually active in its original form. Once you ingest it, your body metabolizes it into modafinil. So its effects are essentially the effects of modafinil. It acts as a precursor. Our sources don't go into huge detail on its unique cognitive impacts beyond that role as a precursor, but it's definitely an important piece of the chemical family.
Got it. Like a trigger that sets off the main event. Now, beyond modafinil and armodafinil, researchers are always, pushing the envelope, looking at other afinils. This is where it gets really interesting, maybe a bit more niche. Let's talk about fladrafinil, also known as CRL 40941. What makes this one stand out in the research world?
Fladrafinil is described as an innovative eugeric compound. And while it does share structural similarities with Adrafinil and modafinil, it has some unique experimental advantages that make it particularly interesting for scientists. Its precise chemical makeup is sort of designed to let researchers explore very specific questions about how these compounds interact with brain pathways.
So it's more like a highly specialized research tool then, not something intended for general use.
Exactly right. It's strictly limited to research use only. It's not for human consumption, acquired only through very controlled channels from certified lab suppliers. This ensures extreme purity, requires meticulous reviews of analysis certificates, detailed chain of custody, all that. Its storage is equally precise, kept at very low temperatures, shielded from light and moisture, in special lab freezers. And before it's even used in an experiment, it undergoes multimodal analytical verification. HPLC for purity, mass spec for molecular weight, NMR for structure. All this intense rigging is to guarantee experimental integrity, make sure results are reproducible, and ensure safety in the lab.
Wow, that sounds incredibly strict. What about its development status? Is it likely to become a widely used medication anytime soon?
Well, as of early 2024, fladrafinil is in preclinical development specifically targeting chronic fatigue syndrome. However, its development for other things like narcolepsy, ADHD, and Alzheimer's disease has actually been discontinued. This really illustrates the very targeted and often winding path of drug development. Compounds get explored and sometimes dropped if they don't meet the necessary benchmarks for efficacy or safety. It also highlights how researchers are focusing on finding precise tools for specific conditions, rather than just a general brain boost.
Okay, and finally, let's touch on esmodafinil. Is it similar to the others, or does it have its own distinct profile?
Esmodafinil is another analog in the family, yes. But it's suspected to be, perhaps, less clinically useful for the main conditions that modafinil and armodafinil treat, like narcolepsy. From a pharmacodynamic perspective, how the drug affects the body, it has about a threefold lower affinity for the dopamine transporter, the DAT, compared to armodafinil. This lower binding strength suggests it might interact differently with dopamine pathways. Interestingly, though, despite that lower affinity, our source mentions it can have equivalent pharmacological effects, meaning similar outcomes, but with different pharmacokinetics, which is how the body processes the drug over time.
And has it been looked at for other uses beyond the usual sleep disorders?
Yes, that's right. Esmodafinil has been researched in preclinical studies for treating cocaine addiction. In that context, it works similarly to Armodafinil by kind of attenuating cocaine's effects. It occupies the dopamine transporter. By doing that, it increases dopamine levels in the brain's reward center, the nucleus accumbens, but importantly, less intensely than cocaine itself does. However, its relatively short half-life actually made Armodafinil seem like a more promising option for that specific line of addiction research. So while it's part of the family, its clinical utility for these particular things seems more limited or perhaps has been superseded by other analogs.
Okay, it's clear these Afinils are complex with subtle but important differences. But the really big question for our listeners is, how do they actually work? What's going on in the brain to produce these wakefulness and cognitive effects? What are the mechanisms?
That really is the core question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what's fascinating, maybe a bit frustrating for researchers, is that the exact full mechanisms are still somewhat inconclusive. We don't have the complete picture of precisely how these drugs stimulate the mind. It's definitely not a simple single action. Instead, early research points towards them acting on a whole variety of different neurochemical systems, often simultaneously. It creates this complex cascade of effects rather than just, flipping one switch. One theory suggests they might increase blood flow to the brain, allowing for more efficient oxygen use, potentially boosting neural activity that way. Another idea is that some nootropics, including maybe some Afinils, might subtly raise the body's adrenaline levels. This could produce effects somewhat similar to drinking a lot of caffeine, certainly contributing to their ability to keep people awake and alert for longer.
So it's not just hitting one target, but potentially influencing a whole network. Let's get into those specific neurotransmitter systems you mentioned. What's the main action that kind of links these Afinils together?
Okay, the Afinils we're discussing, Modafinil, Armodafinil, fladrafinil, esmodafinil, they primarily exert their effects by inhibiting the dopamine transporter, or DT. This transporter normally reabsorbs dopamine from the synapse back into the neuron. By inhibiting this reuptake process, these drugs effectively increase the amount of dopamine available outside the neurons in the extracellular space. This is really significant because dopamine is absolutely crucial. It's involved in systems related to attention, motivation, reward signaling, even aspects of motor control. Now, what's important to note is that modafinil, armodafinil, esmodafinil, and flmodafinil are considered atypical dopamine reuptake inhibitors. This means they don't work exactly like classic stimulants, which might just flood the brain with dopamine more generally. Their specific way of binding to the DAT is different. This atypical profile is thought to contribute to their more focused wakefulness effects and potentially a lower abuse potential compared to traditional stimulants.
Right, that atypical versus classical stimulant distinction seems key. And fladrafinil in particular, you mentioned, has an even more complex profile, affecting other systems too.
It absolutely does. Beyond acting on the DAT, fladrafinil is also known for a dual action involving the orexin system, sometimes called the hypocretin system. This is a really important system in the brain for regulating wakefulness. Stimulating it promotes sustained alertness and plays a critical role in our sleep-wake cycles. Researchers are very interested in how afinils interact here, as it offers deeper insights into sleep-wake regulation. Additionally, fladrafinil indirectly upregulates hypothalamic histaminergic neurons. Histamine, acting as a neurotransmitter here, significantly enhances cortical activation, basically waking up the cortex, and seems to contribute to cognitive flexibility. So you can see it's hitting multiple interconnected pathways at once to create its effects.
And I remember reading modafinil also has some effect on glutamatergic pathways, adding another layer.
Yes, that's correct. There's a strong suggestion that modafinil's action on glutamatergic pathways involving glutamate, the brain's main excitatory neurotransmitter, might be linked with positive effects on encoding processes in the brain. Encoding is that critical first step in memory formation where new information gets registered and processed. And, just as a distinct pharmacological point, flmodafinil has a unique trait. Unlike modafinil, it doesn't induce certain cytochrome P450 enzymes. This is relevant because those enzymes are crucial for metabolizing many drugs. So not inducing them could mean fewer drug interactions and maybe a cleaner overall profile. But it does raise that question. If they influence so many systems, how specific are the cognitive benefits? Are we really looking at broad enhancement or something much more targeted?
That really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Do these drugs genuinely make you smarter across the board, or mostly just keep you awake and maybe better at simple tasks? Let's start where the evidence seems strongest. Modafinil and severe sleep deprivation.
Right. Here, the evidence is indeed quite compelling, quite well established. The core finding across numerous studies is that modafinil is highly efficacious for sustaining and restoring objective performance and alertness during significant sleep loss. And it tends to do this with relatively fewer adverse effects compared to some other stimulants. What's really remarkable is that at the right doses, it can genuinely restore someone's performance and alertness back to levels similar to when they're not sleep deprived. This is exactly why it's valuable in those contexts where vigilance is paramount, like astronauts or military personnel we talked about. It's not just feeling awake, it's restoring actual functional capacity.
Okay, so if you're pulling an all-nighter or dealing with serious jet lag, modafinil can effectively get you back towards a functional baseline. What's a good, maybe a relatable example of this from the research?
A great example comes from that study by researchers at Imperial College London and Cambridge involving sleep-deprived doctors working long shifts. They meticulously looked at modafinil's impact, and they found it significantly improved performance on a series of mental tasks, things requiring sustained attention, quick thinking, compared to the placebo group. This points to its strong wakefulness and simple cognitive restoration effects. However, and this is a really crucial distinction, highlighting its specificity, the study also found modafinil had no effect whatsoever on the performance of a surgical motor skills task.
Ah, okay. That's a very important nuance. It helped them think better, maybe react faster mentally, but didn't improve their dexterity or fine motor control for surgery. So it restores certain mental functions, but isn't a fix for all performance problems caused by fatigue.
Exactly. That finding suggests that while it's excellent at restoring mental alertness and basic cognitive functions when you're sleep deprived, those benefits don't automatically translate to complex psychomotor skills or perhaps broader executive functions. And this leads to a key unanswered question for research. While modafinil is undeniably effective for wakefulness and simpler tasks, we still need more rigorous research to know definitively if it restores higher-order executive functions. Things like abstract thought, complex critical reasoning, planning, nuanced decision-making, situational awareness, effective judgment, or are its benefits mostly limited to those more basic attention-heavy cognitive tasks? Plus, we still need more direct head-to-head comparisons with other common stimulants, like dextroamphetamine or even just caffeine, across different doses and situations to fully understand its unique profile versus those alternatives.
That makes complete sense, really understanding its precise role. But what about the big one? Healthy individuals who aren't sleep deprived. This is where those aspirational smart drug claims really get tested. Is modafinil a universal brain booster for everyone, or is that mostly hype?
All right, for healthy, non-sleep deprived people, the picture gets considerably more complex. And frankly, it's a bit of a mixed bag. There's a very active, ongoing debate in the scientific community about modafinil's effectiveness as a cognitive enhancer in this specific population. On one side, yes, some studies do suggest there might be modest, maybe small improvements in certain areas like attention or some executive functions, often subtle effects, not life-changing transformations. But on the other side, many other well-conducted studies show no significant benefits at all for cognitive enhancement in this group. And in some surprising cases, especially at higher doses, researchers have even observed a decline in certain cognitive functions, perhaps due to overstimulation, maybe increased distractibility.
So what does this all mean then? For healthy folks, that smart drug label, it sounds like it might be a bit of a stretch, right? And if the benefits are so limited for healthy people, why do these smart drug stories persist so strongly? Is it just anecdotes or maybe something psychological?
Based on the overall weight of the evidence, yes, for healthy, non-sleep deprived individuals, the smart drug label is definitely a considerable stretch. The scientific consensus leans towards limited efficacy for modafinil as a broad cognitive enhancer outside of sleep-deprived populations. While maybe very small specific enhancements might occur for some people sometimes, there's just not enough robust evidence to back up widespread claims of general cognitive improvement or a universal intelligence boost for someone already well-rested and functioning well. Any perceived gains are often too small to be practically meaningful in the real world. As for why the narrative persists, it's likely multifaceted. Part of it is surely anecdotal. Someone feels more awake, more alert, and they attribute that feeling to being smarter or performing better, even if objective tests wouldn't show it. There's also likely a powerful placebo effect. Expecting to perform better can sometimes lead to slight improvements, And then there's the immense societal pressure, right? To always be performing at peak levels, constantly productive. That creates a strong demand for anything promising an edge, even if the science isn't fully there. It's just a very compelling story.
That's a really crucial distinction for our listeners to grasp. Now, let's pivot to a very specific, and it sounds like much more promising area. Modafinil, in patients with remitted depression. Why focus on this particular group, and what has the research found there?
This is a hugely important and potentially exciting area because cognitive dysfunction, problems with thinking, memory, concentration, it's not just a side effect of depression, it's often a core feature of the illness itself.
Yeah.
And crucially, even after the mood symptoms like sadness or lack of pleasure get significantly better, these cognitive problems often linger. They can persist. And they have a huge impact on daily life, affecting work, social interactions, just managing everyday tasks. This persistent cognitive impairment also significantly bumps up the risk of relapse. What's particularly challenging is that most current antidepressant treatments, while they help with mood, don't really adequately address this cognitive piece. So there's a big unmet need for treatments that specifically target these thinking deficits.
Okay, so if the usual treatments aren't quite hitting that cognitive fog, could modafinil offer something different, something more targeted? Tell us about a specific study that looked into this.
Exactly. One key study, which listeners can find referenced by its PMC ID, PMC 5339412, was a very carefully designed trial. It was double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled, involving patients whose depression was currently in remission. The design was precise. Participants got a single 200 milligram dose of modafinil, and the cognitive testing battery started exactly 2 hours after they took the dose. This timing was specifically chosen to coincide with when modafinil levels would be peaking in their bloodstream. This ensures they were testing the drug's effects when it was most active, giving the best chance to see any real cognitive enhancement.
And they deliberately used difficult versions of the cognitive tests. Why was that important for the study's design?
That's a critical point for understanding why the findings are robust. They used challenging versions of well-known neurocognitive tests. For example, the Paired Associates Learning, PAL test for episodic memory, Spatial Working Memory, SWM for working memory, One-Touch Stockings, OTS for planning, and Rapid Visual Information Processing, RVIP, for sustained attention. The reason for picking these difficult versions was key. It helps avoid what scientists call ceiling effects. Imagine giving everyone a super easy math test. Even without medication, almost everyone might score 100%. If that happens, you can't tell if the drug actually made anyone better because they already hit the maximum score. By making the tests inherently challenging, they ensured there was room for improvement. It allowed them to really see if modafinil was genuinely boosting performance beyond a typical baseline, not just helping people pass an easy test. It's about detecting subtle but potentially meaningful gains.
Right, making sure there was actually something to measure. So what were the key findings from this very specific, quite challenging study? Did modafinil actually make a difference for these patients?
It certainly did, but in a very targeted and insightful way, which is fascinating. For episodic memory, that's our ability to recall newly learned information, measured by the PAL test. The group that received modafinil showed significantly better performance. They made notably fewer errors compared to the group that got the placebo. And this wasn't just a tiny statistically borderline difference. The effect sizes were medium to large, indicating a substantial and clinically meaningful impact on this type of memory. Our analysis suggests this improvement might be strongly linked to effects right at the initial encoding stage of memory, basically, how well the brain initially records new information. This is particularly relevant because impaired function in the hippocampus, a brain area crucial for encoding, is often observed in depression. We could speculate that modafinil's ability to potentially induce glutamate release in the hippocampus or increase blood flow there might be the underlying mechanisms driving this specific memory improvement.
Wow, that's a specific and exciting finding, actually improving the act of forming new memories. What about working memory, that ability to hold and manipulate information in your mind, which is so critical for daily tasks?
Yes, for working memory, which they assessed using the Spatial Working Memory or SWM test, the modafinil group also demonstrated significantly better performance. And this improvement was particularly evident at the highest levels of difficulty within that test, again suggesting a genuine enhancement, not just overcoming a minor hurdle. This boost in working memory is thought to connect to modafinil's actions on neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and dopamine, specifically in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex brain regions critical for these executive functions. The study also found a really compelling real-world link. How well these patients performed on the working memory test at the start was significantly associated with their overall psychosocial functioning, basically. How well they were managing their daily lives and social interactions. This suggests that improving working memory could be a really critical target for improving overall daily life and functional recovery for people recovering from depression.
So it wasn't like a universal cognitive supercharger for this group then, but rather a very specific, targeted improvement in these key memory functions. This implies a kind of precision we don't really hear about in those general smart drug claims.
That's absolutely correct, and it's such a vital takeaway from this research. Crucially, the study found no significant effects on planning ability, measured by the OTS test, or on sustained attention, measured by the RVIP test. This finding lends even more support to the idea that modafinil doesn't just enhance all aspects of memory and executive function by simply giving a general boost in attention or alertness. It's not acting like a blanket supercharger. It seems to be a more precise, domain-specific intervention, at least in this population. The study concluded that a single 200 milligram dose of modafinil significantly improved both episodic and working memory performance, specifically in patients with remitted depression. This really suggests its genuine potential as a therapeutic agent for tackling those persistent cognitive difficulties that plague so many people even after their mood improves. It kind of hints at a future where cognitive remediation becomes a direct goal of depression treatment.
Of course, every rigorous study acknowledges its limitations. What were some of the caveats here that are important for us to keep in mind?
Absolutely, and the researchers were upfront about these, which is always a sign of good science. First, this study only looked at the acute effects, the immediate impact of a single dose. It didn't tell us about the long-term effects of taking it regularly or if the benefits would last or change over time. Second, most of the participants were already taking regular antidepressant medication. Now, while this makes the sample more like a real-world clinical group, it also meant they couldn't easily separate out effects based on specific antidepressants or compare medicated versus unmedicated individuals. Third, the study focused only on objective test performance. It didn't include measures of how the patient subjectively felt their cognition was. Sometimes subjective feelings align with tests, sometimes not, so having both would have been interesting. And finally, the depression diagnoses were based on clinical evaluation and records, not necessarily a standardized diagnostic interview for the study itself. But despite these limitations, the targeted cognitive improvements they observed are robust and statistically significant. They really set the stage for more, perhaps larger, investigations into modafinil's role in helping with cognitive recovery from depression.
Okay, we've covered the really fascinating potential benefits, especially in these specific clinical situations. But it's equally, maybe even more crucial that we talk about the other side, the risks, the potential side effects, and the broader social and ethical issues around using these compounds, especially off-label.
Absolutely critical. And those warnings from the Alcohol and Drug Foundation really bear repeating here. There is still significantly limited long-term research on nootropics, particularly regarding their non-medical use by healthy people. This means there's a lot of uncertainty about potential ongoing side effects from using them continuously long-term. And critically, there's a very real potential for dependence. This risk is especially concerning, as we touched on earlier, for younger people whose brains are still developing right through their mid-20s. Introducing powerful psychoactive compounds during that crucial window could have unpredictable, maybe even irreversible long-term effects on how the brain develops.
Right. So beyond those general cautions for all nootropics, what are the specific adverse effects people need to be aware of when it comes to modafinil itself?
Okay, so common side effects that users report include things like anxiety, difficulty sleeping, or outright insomnia, dizziness, and headache. Often manageable, but definitely can be disruptive. However, there's also the potential for much more serious, severe adverse events that really demand significant caution. These include rare but potentially life-threatening severe allergic reactions, things like skin rashes that can escalate into very serious conditions like Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Even more alarmingly, there's a documented risk of significant psychiatric effects. These can range from psychosis, experiencing mania, having hallucinations, or even suicidal thoughts or ideation. And importantly, these severe psychiatric reactions can sometimes occur even in people who have no prior history of mental illness. And tragically, these symptoms might persist even after someone stops taking the drug. We also see potential for hypersensitivity reactions affecting different organ systems and negative interactions with other prescription drugs, which can be quite dangerous.
Wow, that sounds incredibly serious, particularly the psychiatric risks. And there's a very specific major risk related to pregnancy, isn't there?
Yes, a very significant critical one that cannot be stressed enough. There is a substantial risk of harm to the developing fetus if modafinil is taken during pregnancy, or even within the 2 months before conception. This is a crucial contraindication and requires very strict attention to birth control measures for anyone potentially affected. In terms of overdose, the symptoms can also be quite severe. They can include both psychiatric issues like intensified psychosis, mania, hallucinations, or suicidal thinking, and serious neurological problems. Things like seizures, tremors, involuntary muscle contractions called dystonia, and other abnormal, uncontrolled movements known as dyskinesia. These all stem from modafinil's potent effects on neurotransmitter systems when taken in excessive amounts.
We've mostly focused on the Afinil family today, but sometimes ADHD medications like methylphenidate also get misused as nootropics for enhancement. Are the risks there similar or maybe even higher?
They often carry significantly higher risks, especially when used by people who don't actually have ADHD. While drugs like methylphenidate, known commonly as Ritalin or Concerta, are incredibly effective and often life-changing for individuals properly diagnosed with ADHD, their use by non-ADHD individuals can be quite dangerous. Research has shown concerning changes in brain chemistry in healthy people misusing these drugs. Changes linked to increased risk-taking behavior, severe sleep disruption, other issues like significant weight loss from appetite suppression. Common acute side effects from misuse can include intense euphoria, which drives abuse potential, but also severe cardiovascular strain, potentially leading to heart failure, and increased hostility or paranoia. The long-term side effects are even more serious and can be devastating. Things like rapid or irregular heartbeat, dangerously high blood pressure, inflammation of heart valves, profound mental health and behavioral problems, seizures, coma, and even tragically death. It really powerfully underscores the dangers and the ethical complexities of using prescription meds off-label for enhancement, especially those designed for specific conditions.
Wow. Beyond the direct medical risks, there are also these significant social and ethical dilemmas swirling around the non-medical use, aren't there? That whole cheating idea often comes up.
Absolutely. The cheating debate is one of the most prominent, most contentious aspects of this whole discussion. Social views on using modafinil non-medically for enhancement vary incredibly widely depending on the context, the culture. In academic settings, for example, places like the University of Sussex have explicitly stated that using it is academic misconduct. They consider it a form of cheating. The U.S. President's Council on Bioethics even called excellence achieved through such drugs cheap excellence, arguing it kind of undermines the value of genuine hard work, learning, personal effort, that it bypasses authentic human striving.
That's a really stark philosophical stance. But what about in other, maybe high-pressure environments? Is the view different there?
Yeah, in stark contrast, if you look at some high-pressure professional settings, think Wall Street trading, demanding tech jobs, some individuals might not see it as cheating at all. The mindset there might be more like, well, if modafinil gives me a competitive edge in a cutthroat field, and I understand the risks, then maybe it's an acceptable, perhaps even necessary tool. This really highlights a fundamental tension between individual autonomy and broader societal values about fairness, achievement, and what counts as natural performance in a world where enhancement is increasingly possible.
And what about the people who actually need these medications for legitimate conditions like narcolepsy? Do they face stigma when their treatment gets caught up in this smart drug controversy?
Unfortunately, yes, they often do. Individuals who rely on modafinil for diagnosed medical conditions frequently face a kind of social stigma. They might find themselves feeling awkward, maybe hiding their medication, denying they use it, or constantly feeling like they have to justify it, even to friends or family. This can be really isolating, sometimes pushing them to seek support, mainly from online communities or groups where others share their medical experiences. It's a tough social dynamic when a necessary medical treatment gets tangled up in controversy because of widespread off-label use.
Okay, so given everything we've discussed, the science, the risks, the benefits in specific cases, what does the future look like for research in this area? Where are the big gaps still, and what's the general direction?
There are definitely still significant research gaps we need to fill to get the full picture. For modafinil specifically, we critically need more studies to really understand its impact on those complex executive functions, things like abstract thought, sophisticated reasoning, complex problem-solving, nuanced judgment. We also still really need those direct head-to-head comparisons with other common stimulants like caffeine and dextroamphetamine across different doses and situations. That would help definitively establish its comparative profile efficacy, side effects, mechanism, giving us a much clearer idea of its unique place, or lack thereof, in the cognitive toolkit.
Right, so less about if it works in some cases and more about how well compared to alternatives and for which specific functions. That makes sense for refining its use.
Exactly. And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, those findings about targeted benefits in remitted depression, they're really significant. They suggest a potential shift in how we even approach treating mental health. Instead of just focusing on mood, these findings point towards aiming for cognitive remission as a new, important objective in treating depression. Future strategies might directly target restoring cognitive function, acknowledging how deeply it affects daily life and long-term outcomes. Modafinil might be part of those future strategies, maybe used alongside psychological therapies to create a more holistic approach to recovery, helping patients not just feel better, but actually function better.
That's a really hopeful and potentially impactful direction for a substance often just seen through that narrow smart drug lens. Are there totally new compounds being developed, or is the research mostly about refining our understanding of the existing Afinils?
Oh, there's definitely ongoing analog development. Researchers are actively working on creating new variations of modafinil, including analogs of fladrafinil, with very specific goals in mind. They're aiming for things like improved selectivity hitting only the desired targets, better metabolic stability lasting longer or being processed more predictably, or more precise receptor targeting to minimize unwanted side effects. This kind of innovative chemistry could potentially yield entirely new leads for cognitive modulation research, maybe leading to novel compounds with fewer downsides or more tailored benefits for specific cognitive issues, moving even further away from just a general stimulant effect.
So even that really specialized lab-only research on compounds like fladrafinil has broader implications for future therapies and just understanding the brain better.
Precisely. Even research that's strictly limited to the lab, like with fladrafinil, provides crucial translational insights. It contributes to our wider understanding of the fundamental molecular workings of things like attention, memory, arousal. And this foundational knowledge, built through careful scientific work, can then guide future drug discovery and innovation. It potentially leads towards developing safer, more effective treatments for cognitive deficits, both in clinical populations with clear medical needs, and maybe one day, perhaps more safely for broader enhancement if research progresses responsibly and ethically. It's all about building a more precise map of how the brain works.
What an incredible deep dive. We've really navigated the complex world of the Afinil family and this broader, often really misunderstood landscape of nootropics. We've covered a lot of ground trying to separate the aspiration from the actual evidence.
We certainly have. And just to recap the core nuance, to bring it all together for you, our listener, modafinil and its relatives are, without doubt, powerful wakefulness-promoting agents. They are highly effective for sleep-deprived individuals, helping restore their objective performance and alertness back towards non-deprived levels. And as we saw with that compelling research in remitted depression, they also show promising, targeted cognitive benefits for specific clinical populations, particularly in key memory areas, hinting at a real therapeutic precision.
But, and this is a huge but, that we really can't overstate, they are absolutely not a universal intelligence pill for healthy, non-sleep deprived individuals. The evidence for broad, general cognitive enhancement in that group is limited, often subjective, sometimes even contradictory, and their non-medical use comes with significant, very real risks from common side effects like anxiety and insomnia to severe psychiatric reactions and that critical risk during pregnancy.
Yeah, our main goal with this deep dive was really to empower you, the listener, to help cut through the often overblown hype surrounding smart drugs and provide an understanding that's firmly grounded in the scientific evidence. It's about giving you the knowledge to be truly well-informed in a world just saturated with claims, many of which aren't well supported.
And so, for our final provocative thought for you to take away and consider, given this complex science, the very real risks, and also the targeted potential benefits we've unpacked today, how does this information reshape your personal view on seeking cognitive enhancement? What does it truly mean to be well-informed in an age where claims about boosting our brains are absolutely everywhere? And how can we apply critical thinking to sort out the genuine scientific insight from the enticing but maybe ultimately unsupported fiction?
That's definitely a question worth pondering long after we finish talking today. The pursuit of knowledge, it always continues.
Indeed it does. Thank you so much for joining us on the deep dive. We truly hope this conversation has given you a clearer, more nuanced understanding of these fascinating yet very complex compounds and what the research actually says about them. Until next time, keep thinking critically and stay curious.